All right, let's take a look at section 4. Here is that focus question. World War II changed Americans' visions of themselves as a people. The fight against the Nazi Empire and its theory of a master race discredited ethnic and racial inequalities. The cultural pluralism of ethnic and racial minorities in the 20s and the Popular Front in the 1930s was now promoted by the government. It argued that the United States differed from its enemies in its commitment to the principle that Americans of all races, religions, and national origins could enjoy the four freedoms. Racism was the doctrine of the enemy, while Americanism meant tolerating diversity and equality. By the war's end, the new immigrants had been accepted as loyal ethnic Americans rather than members of inferior races. World War II brought the new immigrants and their children together with other Americans, drawing millions from urban ethnic neighborhoods and rural areas and mixing them in factories and the military. This patriotic assimilation was in stark contrast to the coercive Americanism of World War I, in which the Wilson administration made Anglo-Saxonism a cultural norm. Roosevelt embraced cultural pluralism as a basis of harmony in a diverse society, and the government promoted Americanism as equality in opposition to Nazi intolerance. Public officials rewrote the past to define American identity as free of racial or ancestral considerations. Repelled by Nazi ideas of inborn racial differences, biological and social scientists discarded the belief that race, culture, and intelligence were linked. Even Hollywood depicted soldiers as a motley force of men from diverse regional, ethnic, and religious backgrounds who placed national loyalty above other identities. Bigotry certainly remained part of American life. Anti-Semitism still contributed to the government's offer of refuge to no more than a handful of European Jews escaping the Nazis. But the war made millions of ethnic Americans feel fully American for the first time, but patriotic assimilation stopped at the color line. The war had a less definite meaning for non-white groups. Before Pearl Harbor, racial barriers were still intact. Southern blacks were confined by segregation, and Asians could not emigrate to the United States or become naturalized citizens. Mexican Americans had been deported during the Depression, and most American Indians still lived in deep poverty on reservations. But the war started changes that would have an impact on the post-war period. Under the Bracero program, which was launched in 1942, tens of thousands of contract laborers migrated from Mexico to the United States to work as domestic and agricultural workers. The program, designed as a temporary war measure, lasted until 1964 and brought a total of 4.5 million Mexican workers into the country. The Braceros were assured decent housing and wages, but were not citizens and could be deported at any time. The war also offered opportunities to second-generation Mexican Americans to move and find work and contributed to the making of a new Chicano culture that fused Mexican heritage and American experience. For Mexican American women in particular, the war afforded new opportunities, and Rosita the Riveter took her place alongside Rosie in West Coast multi-ethnic war production factories. Yet the Zoot Suit riots of 1943 in Los Angeles, in which sailors and police attacked Mexican-American youths wearing flashy clothing, showed the extent of wartime tolerance. But the contrast between discrimination and wartime rhetoric of freedom and pluralism inspired civil rights activism among Mexican Americans, such as protests against employment discrimination. Roughly 500,000 Mexican-American men and women served in the military. Discrimination against Mexicans became an increasing embarrassment in Roosevelt's good neighbor nation. Texas, the state with the highest population of people of Mexican descent, passed the Caucasian Race Equal Privileges Resolution that stated that all Caucasians, including Mexicans, deserved equal treatment in places of public accommodation. The statute did not challenge segregation of blacks and lacked any enforcement mechanism. Discrimination was so bad that Mexico prohibited Texas from receiving bracero laborers for a time. The war intensified debates about the place of Native Americans in American society. Most submitted to the draft, and many worked in wartime industries and factories, on farms, and in military installations. Some Navajos became code talkers, using their native language to transmit messages that the Japanese could not decipher. Despite this, some Indian nations, such as the Hopi and the Yakama, resisted participation in the war, arguing that it was one more attempt by the United States to strip them of essential freedoms. For some Native Americans, the wartime use of Indian land for military purposes and the building of internment camps for Japanese Americans without their consent provided fuel for this argument. Assaults on Indian sovereignty led representatives from 50 tribes to form an organization called the National Congress of the American Indians in 1944 to settle land claims and guarantee enfranchisement to Indians. In contrast, Asian Americans' experience was a paradox. More than 50,000 children of immigrants from China, Japan, Korea, and the Philippines fought in the Army, mostly in all Asian units. With China as an ally, Congress in 1943 ended exclusion and established a very small quota for Chinese immigration. However, many Chinese moved out of ethnic ghettos to work alongside whites in the war industry. In the Pacific, many Filipinos fought under U.S. command, including the majority of the 80,000 soldiers who participated in the Battle of Bataan. Japanese Americans had a very different experience. While many Americans viewed the war in Europe as an ideological conflict with Nazism, Americans and Japanese viewed the Pacific War as a racial war. Japan's propaganda portrayed America as contaminated with ethnic and racial diversity as opposed to the racially pure Japanese, while the attacks at Pearl Harbor stirred long-standing anti-Asian prejudice. Government propaganda depicted the Japanese as animalistic and subhuman and blamed Japan's aggression on racial or national characteristics. Most Japanese Americans in the mainland U.S. worked on farms in California, and while one-third were first-generation immigrants, the majority were Nisei, American-born citizens, many of whom spoke only English and had never been to Japan. Though the government mobilized German and Italian Americans in the war effort and arrested few of the non-naturalized among them, it viewed every person of Japanese ethnicity as a potential enemy. The military, facing an explosion of anti-Asian sentiment and fearing an invasion, persuaded Roosevelt to issue Executive Order 9066 in early 1942 that expelled all persons of Japanese descent from the West Coast. More than 110,000 men, women, and children, two-thirds of whom were American citizens, were removed to internment camps far from home where they were confined in an environment of military discipline and surveillance. Nonetheless, the internees did their best to create an atmosphere of home by decorating their living spaces and setting up activities such as sports clubs and art classes for themselves. Internment demonstrated how easily war erodes basic civil liberties. No court hearings, due process, or writs of habeas corpus challenged the internment, which was supported almost universally by the press, Congress, and the public. The Supreme Court in Korematsu v. United States upheld the policy, arguing that an order applying only to Japanese was not based on race. In 2018, in a case involving President Trump's order banning travel to the United States by citizens of several Muslim-majority countries, the Supreme Court, as an aside, declared that the Korematsu decision was gravely wrong and had no legal standing. Internees were asked to buy war bonds, sign loyalty oaths, and consent to being drafted into the Army. Contradictions abounded in the experience of Japanese Americans. For example, in 1944, Sono Asado danced on Broadway while her brother served in the Pacific Theater, and her father was interned because he had been born in Japan. A long campaign for acknowledgement followed the war, and in 1988, Congress apologized for internment and compensated victims. In contrast to the treatment of Japanese Americans, wartime rhetoric of freedom helped spark significant changes in the status of blacks. While Roosevelt denounced theories of racial mastery, Nazi Germany cited American segregation to support its own policies. Yet segregation and racial violence persisted. The war stimulated a massive migration of blacks, the Second Great Migration, from the rural South to cities in the North and West. But they faced intense hostility, especially in Detroit, where a 1943 fight led to a race riot that killed 34 people and led to a hate strike of white workers against black employment at a war production plant. Lynching continued unabated. Nevertheless, more than 1 million blacks served in the armed forces in segregated units, limited mostly to construction, transportation, and other non-combat duties. Many northern black draftees were sent to the South for military training, where they resented the discrimination they faced and the better treatment given to Nazi prisoners of war. When Southern black veterans sought the benefits of the GI Bill, they faced discrimination that sharply limited their access. While the GI Bill did not discriminate in its health, college tuition, job training, or other benefits, local administrators in the South curtailed, eliminated, or segregated these benefits to blacks' disadvantage. The modern civil rights movement was born during the war. Resentful of the nearly complete exclusion of African Americans from jobs in the booming war industries, the black labor leader A. Philip Randolph in July 1941 called for a march on Washington to demand defense jobs, an end to segregation, and an anti-lynching law. Randolph, who founded the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and fought the racism of unions and employers, criticized Roosevelt's inaction by using FDR's rhetoric, declaring racial discrimination undemocratic, un-American, and pro-Hitler. The march idea alarmed Washington officials, and to prevent it, Roosevelt issued an executive order that banned discrimination in defense jobs and created a Fair Employment Practices Commission, the FEPC, to track compliance. Armed only with investigative powers, the FEPC could not enforce the anti-discrimination order. But its creation signaled an important shift in public policy. The FEPC was the first agency since Reconstruction to fight for equal opportunity for blacks, and it helped obtain jobs for black workers in industrial factories and shipyards. By 1944, more than 1 million blacks worked in manufacturing. During the war, the NAACP's membership rose from 50,000 to 500,000. The Congress of Racial Equality, also known as CORE, founded in 1942 by an interracial group of pacifists, held sit-ins in northern cities to integrate restaurants and theaters. In early 1942, the Pittsburgh Courier used the phrase that embodied black attitudes during the war, the double V. Victory over Germany and Japan, it argued, must be accompanied by victory over segregation in America. Black newspapers and black critics identified the gap between the Roosevelt administration's celebration of American ideals and the reality of race. During the war, a left-based but broad coalition called for an end to racial inequality in America. African American and Jewish groups campaigned against discrimination in employment and housing. Despite resistance from many white workers, CIO unions, especially those influenced by leftists and communists, tried to organize black workers and win skilled positions for them. Although AFL unions continued to discriminate, CIO unions were far more racially integrated. This new militancy among blacks scared moderate white Southerners who now stood between blacks protesting segregation and Southern politicians who defended white supremacy and the South's freedom to shape its own race relations. The war that sparked modern civil rights agitation also generated politics that anticipated the massive resistance to desegregation in the 1950s. But in the North and West, many liberals openly called for a transformation of race relations. Some changes did occur. The National War Labor Board banned racial wage differentials, and the Supreme Court outlawed all-white primaries, which had enabled Southern states to disenfranchise blacks. By the end of the war, the Navy ended segregation, and the Army had established a few integrated unions. In 1942, Wendell Willkie published One World, which sold more than 1 million copies. The book's great surprise came as Willkie emphasized our imperialisms at home and called that a claim to world leadership would lack moral authority if racism was not addressed. The new interest in the status of black Americans was evident in An American Dilemma, published in 1944 and written by the Swedish social scientist Gunnar Myrdal. While his book depicted an America deeply affected by racism in law, politics, economics, and social behavior, Myrdal also showed appreciation for what he termed the American creed, a belief in equality, justice, equal opportunity, and freedom. He argued that the war exposed to Americans more than ever the distance between this creed and racial inequality. By urging the federal government to follow American principles by banning racial discrimination, Myrdal established the liberal position on race relations in post-war America. By 1945, racial justice was integrated in a liberal left agenda that sought full employment, civil liberties, and a larger welfare state. Many liberals now demanded anti-lynching laws, an end to segregated schools and housing, and the expansion of Social Security programs to cover agricultural and domestic workers. This wartime vision of a racially integrated, full employment economy formed a bridge between the New Deal and the Great Society of the 1960s. The internationalism of black radicals in the early 19th century was revived in the early 20th century, partly in reaction to a new global rule of white supremacy across national lines. Garveyism and the meeting of the 5 Pan-African Congresses between 1919 and 1945 that brought together black intellectuals from across the world to denounce colonialism in Africa helped foster this new global consciousness among all people of the African diaspora, a term used to describe the scattering of people who share a single national, religious, or racial identity. Black American leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois and Paul Robeson met future leaders of African independence movements, such as Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya, and Nnamdi Azikiwe of Nigeria in trips abroad. Together, they identified the struggles of Black Americans with Black freedom struggles throughout the world. They argued that racism had started in the slave trade and slavery and persisted in colonialism. Freeing Africa from colonial rule, they thought, would foster freedom in America. World War II stimulated among African Americans an even greater awareness of the links between racism in the U.S. and colonialism abroad, becoming increasingly aware of events in India and China. In 1942, Robeson founded the Council on African Affairs, which tried to place colonial liberation at the top of the Black American agenda. So that was our fourth section. We'll be back with the next one next time.